I'm going to make you, Heather, I'm going to make you a co-host so you can do your thing with slides and so on. It's one of these, I'm sure Zoom fixed things, but in fixing things, they made it impossible to find things for people like myself who are technologically challenged. Anyway, welcome. Thank you for joining. I had a couple of emails from folk. Tonight is the first of two webinars in preparation for the regional meeting of the United Church of Canada. And I notice a couple of people here who are playing hooky, Beth and myself. Now, I don't know about anybody else, and so I won't out anybody else. So they're looking forward to receiving the video when it arrives. Pleasure to welcome the Reverend Dr. Heather McCance, who is our president at the Atlantic School of Theology, who brings lots of years of experience working with congregations in a variety of settings and brings all of that to our work tonight as we think in terms of discipleship in the context of a change and a challenge and maybe even conflict, which I know none of us have ever experienced in our churches. But this we're studying for a friend, just asking for a friend. So, Heather, thank you so much for making time in a very busy schedule to join with us, and I invite you all to join me in prayer. Holy One, as the seasons change, so too do our lives. And in all that happens, you are present with us. You are present with your communities of faith as they wrestle with what it means to be faithful in each new era. We thank you for this group that has journeyed together. We remember those who, for a variety of reasons, are unable to be with us, and we thank you for their friendship and fellowship. And we thank you for this medium through which we are able to meet across the kilometers and learn together. And we ask that you bless us in our learning this night. Amen.
Man.
Heather, we're all yours.
All right. Thanks, Ross. And thank you all. I said to somebody today, I wasn't sure how many we would have, but at least in the part of the world I am in, it's not a terribly nice weather. So I heard somebody, as I was signing in, talk about how it was not, it was a little chilly. So maybe that would actually have more people here because the temptation to be outside is not so great. So this is what I wanted to look at tonight. We're going to start with a small group discussion, and then I want to look at three thinkers who have proposed different ways to think about change in human groups, and how that what they have done might apply in congregations. But it is also my hope that it might be helpful for you in other parts of your life as well. Um, Ross did a bit of an introduction to me. This is a little bit of who I am, at least professionally. I am an Anglican priest. I spent 20 years in parish ministry. I worked in urban and suburban and multi-point rural contexts. I worked on a Doctor of Ministry degree in ministry leadership and mentoring for leadership development. And I also said here that my undergraduate degree was in peace and conflict studies. That was a very long time ago, but when we get to talking about conflict, I do kind of pull up some of those things from that time. I spent 15 years supervising ministry students and interns and curates while I was in parish ministry. And that really shaped a whole lot of my approach to questions of change and transition, because what often happened is I would work with these people um, and they would be really excited about fill in the blank. For some of them, it was social justice ministry. For some of them, it was liturgical change. For some of them, it was spiritual practices, whatever it was. They went into their first congregational setting as a solo minister, as a rector, really excited to just do everything. And nobody had really prepared them for what it is to introduce change. I tried, but I needed more, which is part of how I ended up doing my Doctor of Ministry degree. I moved from parish work to become the ministry developer for the Anglican Diocese of Rupert's Land, which is sort of southeastern Manitoba, northwestern Ontario, the parts of that that are not part of our Indigenous church. And I worked with a number of congregations in that role. I then moved into field education at Montreal School of Theology, and I've been at AST for just under 3 years now. So that's kind of who I am, at least professionally. So that will give you a little idea of the background that I bring to these questions. But I wanted to start here, and that's with your experience. We're going to talk about the conflict piece at our next webinar. This one is going to be largely focused on change and transition. And so this is, I think, just to get our juices flowing a little bit, to think about the first time in your life that you were aware that your church was going through some kind of change together. Now, for some of us, that might have been in childhood. For others, it might have been, 2 years ago, if you're new to the faith or new to church. But what I want to do is to give us an opportunity. We're a small enough group. I'm not going to bother breaking us into like breakout rooms. Um, but to share a little bit about what was happening, what was the change about, what were the emotions around the change? Was there a process that was undertaken to make decisions about the change? So yeah, what do you remember about the decisions and the conversations? And I'm going to go first because I knew I was going to ask myself this question, and that maybe get things going. Um, for me, I was in the junior choir when I was like 9, 10, 11 years old. And there was a proposal to replace our little electric organ with a pipe organ, to install, pipes and all of that. And that was going to be a very expensive proposition, of course. And so there was going to be lots of fundraising, and there were lots of people who were really excited about it. I remember really clearly that my parents were very not excited about it. They thought there were better uses for the money. They thought the money that the church is raising should be going to help the poor, to be doing social good in the world. And it got to the point where now we were moving house at around the same time. But my parents actually decided that that was a good time for us to leave the congregation and to start to worship where we would when we moved. Now, we were only moving about a 20-minute drive away. So if they could do that, they could just pick us up and we moved into a different congregation. So that was one of my first experiences of change and transition in the church. And I honestly don't know. I mean, I know they got the pipe organ, but I don't actually know how it turned out for everybody else in the church, because my parents' response was to just not engage and to withdraw. So I'm curious about, for others, what you might remember about change in the church.
I'm willing to share that I grew up in the Catholic faith, and part of that whole upbringing is that the priest really is the decision maker, and unlike a United Church or an Anglican Church where things are very different. So for me, the biggest change was leaving the Catholic Church and coming to the United Church of Canada, where change is should be somewhere in our banner, our name, because we're changing chairs, and we're changing organs, and we're changing and positively so, women in the pulpit, and gay and lesbian folk, and our willingness to be open to change and ready for change. And what a dynamic environment I came into, given my history and where I came from. And in many respects, it was incredibly both eye-opening and empowering to see the congregation, the body of Christ, having such an opportunity to engage and take part in decision-making processes because it certainly wasn't a part of my upbringing.
Thanks, Jerry. Can I ask at what stage in life you made that switch? Was it, in your early adulthood or your teenage life?
It was my early adulthood.
Okay.
Yes.
Other folks change maybe for yourself as Jerry just shared, or in the congregation that you have been part of.
So it's Neil. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Excellent. So we've been through a lot of changes in our church at Port Wallace United for the years, and we did replace our organ, and nobody thought we could ever pay that off. It'd be forever. Paid off pretty quick, within a year, I think, through fundraising and stuff. But the biggest change that we experienced was in 36-year minister retired years ago. And we
Mhm.
undertook the whole uh, prescribed transition process. Um,
Yeah,
Ross it was a very key part of our transition counselor, and to get where we are today, it's been great.
yeah, yeah.
I think it went really well.
Mhm.
People were more concerned. Uh, it, from what my point of view, I haven't seen it. I mean, certainly there was a lot of people who were not happy on and would like to see another Ivan come in, but most the reality that the man had to retire at some point, and for that, and the the biggest frustration I had with the transition has delays in process, and
Mm,
personally, the delays I see that are being by, by the region,
right,
and
right,
we'll get to a point they want, but it still has to be approved at region. That's good now. And personally, that's coming from business, we wouldn't, and it's not stuff that couldn't be handled earlier anyway.
right, right.
But I irrigation's matured through it, and I am more than cautiously optimistic about the future. We're
Nice.
almost ready to go to call. We have to
Excellent.
wait until they meet, and then we should be able to go out. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
No, that's terrific. And it's interesting to me because with Jerry's story, he talked about, the United Church being so focused on the whole membership and the body of Christ and everybody being part of it, which is obviously very true. But Neil, you're also talking about, and when a minister who's been in place for some time leaves, there's a transition for everybody. So
Correct.
it's both and here, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Anyone else?
I'm going way, way, way back to when my home congregation that I grew up in from the age of 2 to 19. And there was an amalgamation, and it was between two towns that were rival foreign enemies, and they thought it was a really good idea if they combined into one church. And I saw a lot of changes and a lot of people resisting change in and trying to navigate all that. It really kind of opened my eyes. And I remember keep thinking, but we do all these ecumenical things with all our ecumenical partners, but we can't kind of get along with our sister church. And I've seen that over and over again as I grew up, places where sometimes that happens. But I just remember all the turmoil and the transition, and it was kind of thrust upon the church because one of them, their building became inhabitable, so they kind of moved a lot sooner. So a lot of the steps that we might have put in place for, that I've been in congregations with amalgamations that have gone so much better, with transition teams and conversation and communication. It just didn't happen there. So yeah, but it was an eye opener for me to, looking beyond thinking church was always happy and wonderful and everybody got along. I didn't like finding out the truth.
Yeah, yeah, I can hear that. Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, both Neil and Beth, you both sort of talked about the external structures of church, sometimes making decisions that are helpful, sometimes providing resources that are helpful, sometimes being slow to do that, and sometimes making unfathomable decisions. I remember years ago, an amalgamation was done, and in the Anglican Church, you might know that the phrases high church and low church, where the high churches are very Catholic in terms of the liturgy, incense and bells, and then the low church is very simple and plain. And one of the bishops decided that because they were close to each other, these two churches, one incredibly high church, one incredibly low church, should just merge. Unsurprisingly, it was tricky. I think they did make it, but it took a long time to figure out how are we going to worship when we have such very different ideas on what that's supposed to look like, right? Yeah. I'm gonna go back and share my screen some more because wanted to here we go. Can you all see that okay? I think I'm sharing my screen. You can see that? You can see some nods, yes? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Cool. One of the things about sharing screen is it's harder to see you folks. So if you have questions, please unmute and just ask. Oh, and by the way, my spouse and offspring are out for the evening, so which I have the dog here. When they come in the driveway, it's liable to get loud, and I apologize. But they're very exciting, and our dog is not quite two. This is a bell curve. It's a pretty typical bell curve. And folks who study change want us to remember that the bell curve applies to change acceptance. And so there are 3% of people, the colors are just colors, they don't mean anything, are the innovators. They're often the outsiders. They are people, and by cosmopolitan, that's just a word that was found in the text that I was using to talk about able to hold lots of different cultural points of view at the same time. Independent thinkers, these are people who love change. It's only 3% of the population. On the very other end, we have the resistors, also 3%. And these are people who may never accept the change. I remember Doris. Doris was a member of one of the two churches in my first multi-point, and she was appalled that they were widening Green Lane. The regional municipality should not widen Green Lane. They had to cut down too many trees. They had to pave it. They had to, and she spent the rest of her life refusing to drive on Green Lane after it was widened. And the kinds of roundabout routes she had to take to go grocery shopping, or not to get to church because that was on the other side of her, but in order to get to the library, in order to get to her doctors, to avoid going on Green Lane was ridiculous. But she was a resistor. She was never going to accept this change, right? And I think we probably all know some of those. Then we have the early adopters. These are folks who are often creative, they're strong, they're leaders within the church, and they very often are able to see a really good reason for the change. And so they'll be amongst the first to go ahead. Then we'll have the early majority, about 34%, who might go back and forth for a while. We're not sure, but and it's often, if so-and-so says it was a good idea, then I trust so-and-so, then we can move ahead with it. It's very often based on those relationships. And then the late majority, these are sometimes called the bandwagon folks, right? Well, I can't stop it, so I guess I'll go along with it, that kind of thing. And then we have 13% who are conservatives. They might partially adopt the change. They might accept a new kind of worship, but they'd really like to have that traditional kind of worship, maybe at 8 o'clock on the Sunday morning, so they can keep going to it. They are loyalists. If the change is in administration, this is often the bureaucrats, and it's because they're often the ones who are most impacted by implementing the change. And they're often folks who are simply nostalgic for the past. Okay. And so when we think about our experiences of change in our churches, you might be able to start to think about people in your own congregations who might fit in each of these, and you might start to think about where you fit. Now, it's important, of course, what the change is, because some changes you might be more willing to accept than others. Um, but I think, Neil, when you were talking about your minister retiring and some people not wanting him to go and not wanting to see this change happen, even something as seemingly inevitable as a minister retiring when they get to retirement age, we'll still have these resistors, still have these conservatives. And some of those resistors may very well leave the church and not come back if they feel strongly enough about that. And that's got nothing to do with how well the change was introduced or implemented. It's simply a factor of who they are. Okay. Now, Kurt Levine was the first person to suggest change as a process in human groups in terms of formally studying it. As it says here, he was a Jewish German. He served in the German army in the First World War. He started in medicine, but moved to psychology while he was in university because it actually got closer to what he wanted to do, which was after the First World War. You'll remember the phrase shell shock, that people would talk about after the First World War. They didn't talk about post-traumatic stress disorder because we didn't have that language at that point. But what Levine really wanted to do was to work to support his fellow veterans who were really suffering following that war. Of course, he was forced to leave Germany in the 1930s, and so he moved to the US. As I say here, he set up some of that early sensitivity anti-racist training initiatives in the United States, and following the Second World War, rehab of prisoners of war who were suffering from PTSD, using some of the research that he had done earlier following World War I. He is the person who coined the terms action research and group dynamics. You folks probably haven't heard action research much, but I can tell you that our MDiv students use it a lot in their graduate project. And group dynamics, this idea that there is a pattern to how groups of humans get together. And so he talked about forming, norming, storming, performing, that when we start to get together, there's a pattern of how groups work. And that it doesn't really matter who's in the group or what the group is set up to do. The pattern kind of holds. And so, as I say here, he was one of the first to propose models for change management. He also talked about force field analysis. And when I first heard this, I'm too much of a sci-fi geek. Force field, I'm thinking like Star Trek, turn the field on. But that's not what he meant. What he literally meant was, what are the forces at play when we think about a change? And so think about this proposed change. We're going to put a pipe work in the church. We're going to get a new minister. We're going to amalgamate churches. Whatever the change is, it can be big, it can be small. There are going to be forces in favor of that change that are going to push the change along. Some of them will be stronger, and Levine suggested we use bigger arrows to suggest the stronger changes. Some of them will be weaker, so we use the little arrows for those. All right, and then, of course, there are going to be forces against the change. And what Levine said is that if we analyze all of the forces that support the change, that propel the change forward, and all of the forces that resist the change, that are against the change, if those forces are balanced, nothing's going to happen. If the forces against the change are stronger, they're going to push things back to where they were. If the forces in favor of the change are stronger, they're going to move the change forward. That's a very simplistic analysis of what Levine said, but it can actually be helpful when you're thinking of a change in your own life, in your family, in your workplace, in your church, to start to think about what are the forces in favor and against. I mean, in some ways, this is a bit of a pro and con list, but to be able to look at what are we actually dealing with, and the forces against the change, are there things that can mitigate those that will help the change move forward? Okay. This was his model of change. We have a group, we have a system, we have a congregation, and they're frozen in a particular shape. When the change happens, they just melt into a puddle, and then they refreeze into a new shape. Okay. So Neil talked about the kind of place where his congregation is, where there was this shape with a minister there, and they were going along, and they weren't frozen. Levine's thing is a little bit simplistic again, but the structure was in place. You take out the minister, and suddenly everything is at play, and then it will refreeze into a new shape. Okay. Are there any questions about this? Does it seem to make sense? Okay, cool. So what kinds of things can you think about that might unfreeze an organization, that might inspire that change, besides just the change of personnel, which we talked about? Can you think about some other things that would unfreeze where we're at now?
Well, a compelling, like in our case, say it was a situation where passed away, that kind of event would require the congregation to change.
Right,
Not.
right. So that kind of sudden change that no one's really necessarily even responsible for, it just happens, right? Yeah. I have a friend who was the priest of a church that burned down. I mean, obviously, literally the church burned down, but structurally, it certainly forced all sorts of things into that kind of melty state. Yeah. Yeah.
Finances, a
Same
change
on
in
this one.
finances.
Yeah.
Well, if you suddenly get a huge bequest, for instance, that might change what you intend to do with your ministry. Or if you find that your givings have been going down, how do you support the ministries that you have with fewer finances?
Right. Right. So some of those changes are like really sudden, and some of them, like the bequest, is a very sudden thing, but the givings going down happens really gradually, right? And sometimes it takes somebody, the story of the emperor's new clothes. Somebody at some point says, the emperor's got no clothes on. But it's been happening for a long time. So yeah. In the change state, in that puddle, if you will, I'll go back to it. What Levine said is that it's not just the obvious stuff that has unfrozen. So if a minister suddenly leaves the congregation for whatever reason, it's not just the minister that's changed. What Levine said is that everything in the structure suddenly becomes at play. Okay. And so what happens in the change state is a lot of flux and chaos and trying to figure out what's going on. And in that refreeze state, the second shape, the new shape, what's happening there is the people are just trying to find a way to function, right? Now, sometimes this works well in say, a pastoral transition. When a minister leaves, you've got this change, and then a new minister comes in, refreeze. I think that's the idea. I'm not sure that always happens. And I think partly Neil identified the slowness of the process. I think sometimes what happens is that the congregation refreezes before the new minister comes in. They have found a way to continue to move forward, to continue to worship, to continue to minister. And so when the new minister comes in, it's actually back to the melty stage, and then you refreeze again, right? Because change keeps happening, and so you keep going through this cycle.
I'm sure that's what will happen.
I'm sure that's what will happen. Yeah, because it's been long enough. Now, that's not an unhealthy thing. Levine is not saying that this is a bad thing. He was trying to describe what happens to humans, right? He was a psychologist who started working with folks who'd been through all sorts of stress, and then he moved into sort of this group psychology to try to understand change. This isn't in any way a judgment. This is simply an explanation. And he actually used, the metamorphosis of caterpillar to butterfly as an example, right? You've got one thing, it closes in, it does its own thing. I'm told, I've never opened a cocoon, that in the cocoon, it's kind of just a bunch of goo. Like, it doesn't look like either the caterpillar or the butterfly. It's just a bunch of goo inside this cocoon, which the genetic material for the butterfly that slowly starts to reform. So, which is why, unlike when I was a child and I thought it was just the butterfly was just a caterpillar with wings, it's actually a completely new thing, right? And so Levine used this as an example to say, we see this in nature all the time, and it's really important for us to learn from creation. So that was Levine. Oh, went too far. William Bridges then came in and studied Kurt Levine's change management processes, and he made a very important shift. He said, change is what happens to people. Okay, so it is external and often imposed. The structures of the church that have decided these two congregations are going to merge. There is a fire in the church. The minister says that they're going to retire. I mean, those are the obvious ones, but it can also be the neighborhood that the church is in has changed so much. We used to be a bigger town in a rural area, and now everybody's moved to the city, and there's just not that many people around anymore. Or the neighborhood in the town or the city where we live has changed its demographics, and it used to be all folks from a particular background, and now it's all folks from a different background or a whole mix of backgrounds. And that's been a change that has happened. And so the change that happens to us is external. It may be imposed. Transition is what happens within us and among us. So Bridges was really concerned to make that distinction between change and transition. His book, Managing Transitions, was first published in 1991, and it was aimed largely at a business audience. However, all sorts of religious organizations, nonprofits, recognized themselves in it, and in later editions, he actually included work with synagogues and churches in amongst his research. He also published a book that I found really helpful called The Way of Transition in 2001. And he published that book after his first wife had died and after he had remarried. Because what he wanted to do in that time, and he said he started it just as his own journaling and his own processing of grief and moving on, was to show how this transition model that he had talked about for groups of people actually happened for him as an individual, going through perhaps the most profound change human beings do go through in the loss of a spouse. And it's a really wonderful book. I found it incredibly helpful when I was moving from Southern Ontario to Winnipeg in terms of the process of losing a whole lot and moving into something new. It was really helpful to me. Bridges' overall thesis is that change cannot be successfully implemented or managed if the transition journeys of those involved in the change are not tended to, including your own. So the change is going to happen. If we've decided to make a change, that's one thing. If it's happened to us, that's another. But either way, the change cannot be successful unless we are managing the transition. What's going on between us in terms of our groups and our friendships, our relationships, and what's happening within us, our own emotional responses to the change. Now, as people in the church who are used to thinking about being pastoral and caring for one another, this might seem obvious, but remember, he was writing for a business audience in the early 1990s. This was the era of that movie Wall Street with what was his name? Michael, I forgot his
Michael
last name. Anyway,
Douglas.
thank you. Yes, greed is good, right? Like, this is the same era. And so for Bridges to come and say, actually, we need to be concerned about the emotions of the people involved was pretty revolutionary. And this is what he discussed. Now, at a certain level, at a very basic level, this is not unlike what Levine said, and that makes sense. He was building on what Levine had done. And so think about this as a graph. So the horizontal axis is from end to beginning, the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the passage of time. All right. And so when a change first happens, there's a whole time of ending. And we deal with all of the stuff that goes with ending. And when the change first happens, there's a ton of ending energy. There's all of the loss and the grief and the anger and all of those things, and the saying goodbye to what was, and the looking backwards, and the missing what used to be, and then the laughing at the fun stuff that used to happen, and so on. Then there's this neutral zone. And this corresponds to Levine's puddle, right? And Bridges said, in the neutral zone, there's a bunch of chaos, there's a bunch of uncertainty, there's a little bit of hope, there's a little bit of curiosity, I wonder what's going to happen. And then there's the new beginning, which is that refreeze, that new shape that Levine talked about. Now, you'll notice that from the very moment the change is introduced, there's already a little bit of new beginning energy starting. There are people in this world who find change exciting and invigorating. And this is what this is, right? Is this little bit of excitement about what might come. We really loved our last minister, but he was kind of tired, and I wonder what new energy a new person might bring. Or, that old organ was really not sounding very good. I imagine it's going to be so much better. And so you start with that new beginning energy at the same time as this overwhelming goodbye energy and this little bit of chaos, curiosity, uncertainty energy. And they all happen at the same time from beginning to end of the change and throughout this time of transition. This happens for each of us as individuals, and this happens within our groups, our organizations, whether that's a church congregation, whether it is a business setting, whether it's a family. And you can probably think of some ways that this has taken place. I mean, think about the birth of a new child in a family, especially a first child. And so the couple is, really excited, but also really scared and uncertain. And at some level are missing that time that they used to have it just for each other. And it takes time and management of the relationships to move into just being good with the new beginning, right? So you can think of all sorts of other examples where this might work. Again, this was Bridges talking particularly about business. And so he talks about productivity. But in a congregation, you might simply say the normal life of the congregation. And so this is just another illustration of this. that in these ending times, you have shock, you have denial, you have anger, and this normal productivity. Neil, I haven't asked you this, but I know in a lot of congregations in that time of transition, the stuff that congregations do often is less, especially if the minister was the one who did a lot of stuff. So if the minister was the one who led Bible studies, well, there's not going to be as much Bible study. So you're not going to be as productive if you were.
Yeah.
If, those are the kinds of things. And so you get these ending emotions, you get this frustration, apathy, confusion, listlessness, of this period that's neither here nor there. You're betwixt and between. And then you start to get some engagement, and then you get some excitement, and then you get some high energy. And as a result of this period, which is completely normal, it's not a bad thing to have a break from stuff. And the other thing that often happens in congregations going through a particular change is that we become much more inward looking. And I whether that's a change like a change in minister or a change like a global pandemic, we become one much more inward looking. And then when the new beginning starts, we are engaged, we are excited, we have more energy, and suddenly we're doing way more than we were before the transition and change happened. Okay, so this is another way to think about Bridges' model and what it looks like in the life of an organization. So this is what Bridge says the ending zone is about. That we identify the impact of the change event. Remember, change is something that happens to us. So he would talk about change event on various stakeholders and communities. And so we get a sudden bequest. What impact is that going to have on various individuals in the community? What impact is that going to have for us as a whole? What impact is it going to have on Doris? What impact is it going to have on the outreach committee? What impact is it going to have on fill in the blank? And so some of that obviously is about figuring out who's going to be most impacted and recognizing that we're all going to be impacted. Attending to the grief, anger, denial, and other emotional responses, including your own, and expressing this publicly. The more those people who are leaders in the church, and it doesn't matter whether you're lay or ordained when I say the word leader, the more people who are on a church council, on a board, in committees, who are able to say out loud things like, I really miss our old minister, and I'm not quite sure who we're going to be without him, can give permission to other people to say the same things. It's important to own those feelings yourself so that you're not projecting them, because people are going to respond differently. But to be able to say these things can be really, really helpful. I know that, and I know we're doing conflict next time. When I was leading a congregation that was going through significant conflict, I preached from the pulpit about a little bit about what I was feeling and what I had heard others in the community feel. And people came to me so relieved, because at a certain level, it allowed them permission to feel what they were feeling. And we all know that when you don't feel what you're feeling, it just gets stuffed and comes out sideways in inappropriate ways. Defining what is ending and what is not is really important here, both big picture and small picture, so that people aren't trying to continue the old way and start the new way at the same time, because that's not possible. But to be able to say, this is how we used to do the thing. This change is going to mean these changes in new ways of how we do the thing. Giving people information again and again and again and again and again and again and again. They say that, they used to say that we had to say the thing 7 times before we could expect the whole congregation to have heard it, and in different ways. So like announcements, printed announcements, posters, whatever. websites, spoken announcements, whatever it is, at least 7 times. Our communications manager at AST tells me that that's now doubled. It's at least 15 times because our attention is being drawn in so many different directions all the time that we have to hear the thing. And I'm saying hear, read, see. You have to receive the information as many as 15 times before it will sink in. So people who are closer to the change and know the process and know what's happening feel like, of course, everybody knows what's going on. And actually, they don't because they have other things going on in their lives. And so it's really important to do it again and again and again and again. And then finding ways to give back in order to balance what is being lost. So in every change, there's going to be people who lose things. They might lose status, they might lose recognition, they might lose a feeling of control. When a minister leaves, there might have been people who were particularly close to her and feel like they're not going to have the same kind of influence in the congregation that they used to have. They're When there's a bequest, well, the biggest giver in the congregation isn't the biggest congregation anymore. That might feel a little strange. And so finding ways to ensure that people who used to have particular roles in the community, who used to feel like their gifts were used in particular ways, can continue to find ways to be involved and to be valued, even throughout the transition and change process. This all makes sense to people? Okay. Are there questions at this point? I'm going to go to the neutral zone in a sec.
I think certainly for the United Church and perhaps the Anglican Church as well, we are so relentlessly positive sometimes that we don't make space for those things. I remember I do a certain amount of consulting with congregations and suggesting to the people that in this was in another actually in another province, suggesting to them because their pastoral relationship had ended badly, that maybe somebody needed to do some work processing the feelings. And they looked at me like I had two heads because, like, we're just going to move on. Like, it's just, we're going to take this widget out and put that widget in. And to try and get them to understand that there were feelings, there were emotions, and they were going to appear. So, what are we going to do with them, folks? But they just like, oh no, we're just going to move on. And
Yeah.
that was a contract that I didn't get because clearly they didn't want to back up and look at what they were feeling. And I feel really badly for the next person who shows up there because they're going to inherit all of that. And but it's going to be really twisted and ill. It's not going to
Yeah.
be healthy.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think so our culture, as you say, relentlessly positive. I also think there is a fear for some that if we start down that road, we're going to wallow. We're never going to get past the grief. We're just going to be stuck in it. But actually, the work of psychologists would suggest the opposite. We're more likely to be stuck in it if we don't express it. So it's really important to find ways to do that. I'm going to be back in literally half a second. My computer's telling me I have to plug it in. So. I didn't want it to shut down on us. So the neutral zone tasks, those tasks, that time when things are uncertain and scary and we're not sure what's going on, it can lead to apathy, it can lead to withdrawal. If there's a lot of change going on in a congregation, people might, and this happens a lot, the minister leaves, a bunch of people slowly drift away until a new one comes and then they come back. So communicating. People are in this neutral zone are going to be uncertain and scared and confused. They don't know what to expect anymore. The old ways of doing the thing aren't working, but we haven't figured out the new ways yet. What are we doing? normalizing those emotions, as Ross was saying, of disorientation and discomfort, we don't really know, and that's okay. It's okay to not know, and to communicate what we can. Sometimes that requires some training for doing things in a new way. And, somebody like Ross or like me when I was in Rupert's Land can come in and support a congregation with training on how to do the steps. The process might be slow, it might be messy, it might not be welcome, it might um, not be well done. But the need for there to be a process is strongest in this neutral zone so that people don't feel like they're completely that unfrozen mess of goo, if you will. Like they need people need to have some certainty in life, and to have that kind of process in place to help people through this neutral zone can be really important. And so we have those sort of temporary policies and procedures. Okay, since the old thing isn't happening anymore, for the next year, we're going to do this, or we're going to pilot this, or we're going to experiment with that, where there's roles and structures and gives people that sense of it's not, we haven't thrown everything up in the air. There is still stability. We are still able to do the things. It's also a really important time to reinforce those emotional and relationship connections between people and groups of people as members of the whole. Because the structure is in flux, other stuff is uncertain, but I still love you. And we're still part of this community together. And that's really, really important. And so we're going to continue to tend to those relationships. And in fact, maybe giving even more attention to those relationships in this uncertainty time. It's important in this neutral zone to ensure that we're supporting experiments by not punishing failure. So I said, we're going to try something. We're going to pilot something. This neutral zone is often a time when those things are happening. Let's give this a try for 3 months. Let's give this a try for a year. We don't want to punish if failure. And I think most of us in the dominant culture in Canada are conditioned to succeed, to try to succeed. And we don't want something to fail. The only time we failed is when we either didn't try or we didn't learn from what we did try. And those are really important things for people to hear, because this is the time when we are starting to establish what will come next. And so we're going to try it for a while and we'll see what happens. And if we punish somebody who wants to give something a try and it doesn't go as we'd hoped, nobody else is ever going to step forward and try something again, right? And so that's really important, and can happen right from the get-go of somebody having an idea of a new way of doing the thing, to say to the whole group, to the whole congregation, let's see what we can learn when Becky leads us through this thing. We'll all get back together and see what we've learned, as opposed to setting Becky up for failure by saying to Becky, go do it and see and good luck. Ask all the questions. This is partly about tending relationships. It's the asking how are you and really meaning it kinds of questions, but it is also part of that communication piece that's at the top of the screen. Making sure that we are clear about what we're not clear about. What questions do we have? What does need answering? Where can we go for more information? Where can we get the resources? Asking all the questions. And then we have this new beginning. And the tasks in the new beginning zone, recognizing that there's going to continue to be some ambivalence, right? Like this is this piece over here that in the new beginning, we still have some ambivalence from what was the ending. We still miss so-and-so, or we still have some nostalgia for the way things used to be, whatever it is, to recognize that that's a normal and a good thing. Continuing to clarify and communicate the purpose of the idea behind the change as well as the outcome. So again, if all we're focused on is the outcome and it doesn't turn out the way we thought, we don't want to lose the purpose of the idea that started the change in the first place. So if the purpose of the idea behind the change was to recognize that our church that used to be surrounded by people who looked and sounded like us suddenly has a different immigrant group in it. And so we created some kind of programming, we changed our worship, we did all sorts of stuff with the intention of welcoming these folks into our church, and they didn't come. Well, we want to continue to honor and communicate and clarify the purpose of the idea. We want our church to be relevant in the life of our neighborhood, and these people are the ones who are our neighbors now, even if the outcome wasn't what we had expected. Okay. Help people understand the role that they play in this new reality and honor them for it. I talked earlier about how leaving behind an ending was going to cost some people their role, their status. They weren't sure if their gifts were going to be needed. Their gifts might not be needed. In this new reality, the way that we used to do things needed different gifts than the new thing does. But that doesn't mean we don't value the people. And so sometimes this is about inviting people to try something new, offering them training. Please don't ask people to do something new without giving them some training and support. The church is really bad for doing that on a regular basis, honestly. And honor people who are willing to step forward. Making sure that policies and procedures and structures are supporting the desired new reality. I was talking to a colleague over the weekend at Convocation, as Ross was saying, and she was talking about being in a church that used to have attendance of 250, and now they've got 80. And 80 is still a pretty good sized congregation, but their church board and their committee structure and all of that was still assuming a congregation of 250, and the 80 people who were left were exhausted because they were constantly at meetings and it made no sense. So we want to make sure that we've got structures that are going to support the new reality and not just be carrying over stuff from the past. Checking whether and how the system might be continuing to reward and or operate in the old ways. This one is a little bit more complicated, but if the old system assumed that we were going to all, I'm trying to think of a good example. If the old way of doing things assumed that we were going to pray or we were going to know everything about everybody, but the new way of doing things has to take new privacy legislation into account. We can't reward or operate in a way that ignores that. I know lots and lots of churches who've had to change how they pray out loud in public for people. I know lots of people who want to know who's in the hospital and what's wrong with so and so who's in the hospital, and they bug the minister to find out what's wrong with so and so who's in the hospital, and the minister is not allowed to share that information, right? And if so and so, the lay pastoral visitor goes in and visits this person and then comes back and tells the whole community what's wrong with the person in the hospital, that person will get rewarded, if you will, by everybody saying, oh, thank you, you're such a wonderful friend, you're so great, keep us all together and building our relationship. Doesn't help us move into the new reality. Building in plans for quick successes and celebrating them. So this is where you have those little mini experiments to try something that we think is going to work, and it works, and we celebrate it. Any of those kinds of things that can help us to move into that new reality more positively. All right. I want to take a break, partly because I want to put my dog in the crate so that when my family gets home, it's not loud here, but also so that y'all can have a bit of a break before we move into the next section. And I'm quite sure you'll all come back with questions from what I've just said. So, Ross, what's a good time break? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, something like that?
Well, let's go with 5.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and I'll see you back.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So I just wanted to throw this screen back up for a second because I want to show you an example that Bridges himself actually used to talk about the model of transition. And this will look familiar. The people of Israel leaving slavery in Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, and then moving into the promised land. You can almost immediately see the ending, the neutral zone, and the new beginning. But I'm going to take you through it anyway. So, in our endings in this Exodus story, there is grief, there is denial, there is anger. We have Moses' resistance to God's call. We have his response in the wilderness, no, I can't be me, I can't talk, I can't do this. And then we have the former enslaved people who are saying, we would have been better back in Egypt where, at least we knew there was food coming to us. There was identification of the new leadership that was going to take us out of the old into the new. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, all with different roles, but clearly these were going to be the leaders. There was the defining of what is ending and what is not. And the Passover ritual, which of course continues in a different form to this very day for Jewish people, was a reminder that we will always be a people who formerly were enslaved and whom God has brought out into freedom. And sometimes ritualizing the part of what we were allows people to say goodbye to it and to move it forward. And then we think about what was given to the people to compensate for what was lost. God gave them manna, God gave them water from a rock, God gave them quails, all of those stories, when there were snakes, there was, put a snake on a pole and you can be healed, all of those stories from the Exodus that talk about how the people had to learn to say goodbye to Egypt and move forward into the next thing, which was this neutral zone. So, this feeling of uncertainty and disorientation, this desire to return to Egypt, the golden calf. Can we please have something that we can see and touch, something that's tangible and real in this time of incredible uncertainty? We had a temporary structure put in place. So one of the things that happened when they left Egypt behind is that, the Egyptians, in addition to enslaving them, also provided all of the law. They were the law enforcers. They gave the law. And so Moses, of course, delegated to the 70 elders so that they could help the people to deal with disputes, to make decisions. And then this identity piece. I talked earlier about that one of the things about the neutral zone was that sense of relationship and identity. We are all connected. We are all part of one another. Who are we going to be now that we're not where we used to be? Who are we? And so this is the place in which, in this time of wilderness, that God chooses to give the law to the people. And it's right at the beginning of those 40 years. It's not and now Moses reiterates them in Deuteronomy as they're about to enter the promised land. But I think it's really telling that the people of Israel receive the law from God at the beginning of this neutral zone time. They didn't get it in Egypt. They didn't get it once they'd already settled the promised land. They got it in this neutral time when they were redefining who they were and who they were in relationship to God. There was a certain amount of looking forward. So we see the sending of the spies into the promised land and all sorts of communication where Moses called the people together, where towards the end of his life, he at God's command, commissioned Joshua to be the leader who was going to carry them forward, which actually I think is an also important point, that sometimes the leadership that have taken us from the ending into the neutral zone may not be the same leaders who take us from neutral zone into the new beginning, depending on the state of the change. If we're talking about a small change, that's less likely. But if you're talking about the kind of change that happens over a period of years, it may well be. I know that in a lot of cases when there is a church amalgamation, the people who have ministered the old congregation are not the person who's going to minister in the new amalgamation, right? Sometimes that needs new leadership. And then we have the state of new beginnings. And so there's this celebration, celebrating the arrival, recognizing some continuing ambivalence. We're not sure about this new place. There are giants, and there are Canaanites, and there are Jebusites, and there are Hittites, and we're not sure about these people. But they continue with the rituals and the storytelling to continue to bring from the past who they were. And so that very first harvest, they're commanded to bring the first fruits and to say, my father was a wandering Aramaean, and God rescued my people from slavery in Egypt, and to continue to tell those stories as a hearkening back to where we used to be and what has shaped who we are today. This clarify what can be clarified. And so Joshua's role was very often, while he was a military leader, which tribe is going to settle where? This is your land, and this is your land. And Levites, you're going to be in charge of leading worship, and you folks are going to have the cattle, and you folks, like, it was all very clear. It's one of the most boring bits of the Bible, honestly, but I recognize that it is a good example of Bridges transition theory. How we are going to work together as one people. The structures that worked in Egypt are clearly not working here. There's those work for quick wins. And so a couple of the tribes, even before they get into the fullness of the promised land, come to Joshua and say, actually, the land where we're at right now is pretty good. Can we just settle here? And Joshua prays and asks God, and God says, yeah, that works. And Joshua says, sure, you guys this can be your land. You still have to come with us to fight the battles for everybody else to get their land, but this can be your land, right? And so this was a quick win. It was sort of establishing that this is part of our land. And then, of course, the military victories continued to establish that this promised land is theirs. I recognize that this is difficult pieces for colonialism, and given the state of things in the Holy Land today, I'm just using it as an example. Okay, we can talk about that other stuff. And then obviously new structures and procedures. In Egypt, there was one set of structures and procedures largely governed by the Egyptians. In the neutral zone, there was a different set of structures and procedures. Moses as leader, the 70 elders. And then once they moved into the promised land, there was very quickly new structures and procedures set up under Joshua. Okay. And this is, again, as I said, just an example of Bridges transition. All right. I'm going to move into the final thinker about change management and change and transition. And this is John Cotter, again, largely worked in the business world. His background was in electrical engineering and computer science. At the age of 25, he joined the faculty of the Harvard Business School. Now, you have to be incredibly bright to be on the faculty of the Harvard Business School, and to do it at 25, you have to be very, very, very smart indeed. He spent his career studying change in human organizations. And what he said was, Bridges is not wrong. Levine was not wrong. But sometimes you don't only want to experience transition and change. Bridges was very much change is what happens to us. Cotter wanted to say, sometimes we need to make change happen, and we need to manage it well. Okay. And that can be often in response. Michelle, you talked about, sort of givings going down over a period of years, or attendance going down over a period of years. Sometimes change needs to happen in response to those kinds of things, and we need to manage it. And this is what Cotter wanted to talk about. And so he came up with 8 steps of change management. The first one was to create a sense of urgency, to show the community why change is necessary. Step 2 was to form a powerful coalition. I'm going to go through these in more detail in a few minutes, but to bring together the people who need to be part of the leadership team. He was not, Cotter's not ever been an advocate for like a solo Lone Ranger kind of leader. He said, you need a coalition. You need the right people in the room to manage this change. You need to create the vision for where we are trying to get to, and you need to communicate that vision over and over and over again. Look for the obstacles, pull those out of the way first, create those short-term wins, and then build on the change as it is happening. Change is not usually just a one-time thing, and so as it takes place, you're going to continue to build on it, and then anchor the changes in the culture. Cotter wouldn't say to refreeze, as Levine did, but to say, these, not only are we anchoring this particular change, but we are anchoring the ability of our organization, of our group, of our congregation to change. One of the things that people told me after COVID and the pandemic was, look, churches who thought they couldn't ever change clearly can, because they did. The ones who didn't last. But lots and lots of us found new ways to do things. You and I would not be communicating over this piece of technology if we hadn't figured this out, right? And so in some churches, that got anchored. In other churches, leaders were able to say to people, look, we made this change. We are capable of change. What other change is God calling us to make? Okay. And so that's what Cotter wants to say in that 8th step there, that we're not just anchoring the change itself, but the possibility of change. All right. We're going to watch a parable. This is called Our Iceberg is Melting. Cotter wrote this as a short book, as a parable to explain his steps in the change management program. This video is about 10 minutes long, and this is shortened somewhat from a longer version. As you watch, you might want to think of the different roles that different penguins are playing. It can be fun to think, who in my congregation sometimes plays this role?
This is a story about a flock of penguins who live on an iceberg in Antarctica, the South Pole.
I want to make sure, is everybody hearing? Yeah, good, cool.
They are like a big family. They have been living as a colony on this iceberg for years, as far back as they can remember. It is their home. They don't know it yet, but change is coming for them. In order to survive, they will need to learn the change management process, one step at a time. When they aren't hunting for creatures in the sea, they spend most of their time with friends and relatives. Except this one, Fred. Fred is unusually curious and observant. He watches the sea and stuffs his observations, ideas, and conclusions in a briefcase. One day, Fred learned something alarming.
Oh boy, I have to do something. I gotta tell Alice.
This is Alice. She is one of the Penguins' leadership council members. She is tough and has a reputation of getting things done.
Alice, can I speak with you for a moment? I believe that our iceberg is melting.
Really? Well, show me what you mean.
So Fred took Alice to the heart of the iceberg.
See, Alice? Our iceberg has cracks that lead to larger caves. If the ice melts sufficiently, water will pour into these cracks and caves. If we have a cold winter, the water in these cracks can freeze quickly, trapping water inside the caves. Then, as the temperature goes lower, the water in the caves will freeze too. This freezing liquid will expand in volume, causing our iceberg to break into pieces. This could destroy our home and place us all in great danger.
This is not good. We must bring this information to the Leadership Council.
I'll prepare a presentation to convince them that something must be done.
The Leadership Council consists of Lewis, the head of the council, Alice, Buddy, the handsome, charismatic one, and Nono, a cranky penguin who is responsible for weather forecasts.
Causing our iceberg to break into pieces.
This is wild speculation and fear-mongering. Our iceberg can withstand such fluctuations. Can he guarantee his data and conclusions are 100% correct?
I can't. But if our iceberg breaks into pieces in winter, wouldn't many of us die?
Imagine parents who lost their children coming to us and asking, "Why didn't you foresee this crisis? It was your job to protect the colony." What would you tell them?
If Fred is correct, we only have 2 months until winter to react to this threat.
We must inform everyone. This calls for a general assembly of the colony.
No! It would be very bad to worry them.
We don't want to panic anyone.
We must keep this a secret.
I have an idea. Would you give me a few minutes, please?
Fred went quickly down the mountain and arrived minutes later with a glass bottle.
Let's fill this bottle with water, seal it, and leave it in the ice overnight. Then tomorrow we can see if it's broken by the force of expanding water as it freezes. If I am correct, the bottle will be broken.
Let's do it. We'll meet here tomorrow morning.
The next morning they found the bottle broken.
Oh.
I'm convinced. We have to do something about this.
Let us call a general assembly of the colony.
And with that, the penguins started the change management process with step 1. Create the sense of urgency.
Clearly, our iceberg is in danger, but I am confident we will find a solution. We need to act quickly.
The next step was step 2. Pull together the guiding team. A diverse team of 5 penguins was given the task of finding a solution. Lewis, Alice, Fred, Buddy, and Professor, who was the smartest penguin in the colony. Each had different strengths, and together they were the best team for the job. Their task was step 3 of the change management process. Develop change vision and strategy.
I've got an idea. Let's move to the center of Antarctica, where ice is thicker and stronger.
We will be too far from the water. How will we get fish?
What about using superglue to hold the iceberg together?
That's very funny.
Look, up there. The seagull. It can't fly forever. It must have a home somewhere.
It could be very lost, but it doesn't seem to be afraid. What if moving from one place to another is just the way it lives? Like a nomad.
I can almost see how we might live. We'd learn to move around. We wouldn't try to fix melting icebergs. We would just face up to the fact that what sustains us can't go on forever.
Our founder had this same idea when he moved our colony to this iceberg years ago. This sounds like our best shot. Let's inform the others.
Their next step was number 4. Communicate for understanding and buy-in. Lewis called a general assembly again to tell all of the new strategy. Since Buddy was the best storyteller, he was chosen to tell the story of the seagull. Then Lewis addressed the crowd.
We are not chained to this piece of ice. Let it melt and break. We will find other places to live that are safer.
Although many penguins were relieved to hear this, many were still skeptical. So Alice came up with the idea of putting slogans on ice posters to win over the support of the colony. They worked hard to educate and gain their support. Then they moved the plan forward with step 5. Empower others to act.
A scout team should go and look for another iceberg. Assemble a team and get ready.
Yes, sir.
Of course, it didn't go smoothly at first. Arguments broke out among the scouts, but Lewis dealt with them in a straight and direct way, keeping the focus on the main task. Then Nono started forecasting storms to discourage the scouts and lower morale. Lewis told Nono that his forecasting services are not needed at this time. Many of the penguins, particularly the young ones, were scared about the upcoming move. Buddy asked the teachers of the colony to speak about bravery to these young penguins. He inspired them to come up with Tribute to Our Heroes Day for when the Scouts return. Next, they needed to act and make some progress. This is step 6. Produce short-term wins. The strong, bright, and highly enthusiastic Scouts jumped into the water and searched for a new iceberg that would be good enough for them to move to.
My life was boring. Scouting is fun! I will do this for the colony! My family will be so proud of me!
When the brave Scouts finally returned, they were tired and hungry, but they were greeted with a hero's welcome. They were given medals and food. They told amazing tales about the sea, about swimming long distances, and about new icebergs they had seen. As happy as everyone was to have this successful trip completed, it was no time to rest. They pressed onward with step number 7, don't let up. The next day, a second group of Scouts went out and found the best iceberg for their new home.
This iceberg has everything we need. A tall snow wall and good fishing sites. During the migration, our young and old can rest along the way on small icebergs.
Let's waste no time. Start the migration before winter hits.
The colony moved to the new home. The move was chaotic at times, but with Lewis's leadership and Buddy's encouragement, they arrived safely on the new iceberg. However, they still needed to take one last step. Number 8, create a new culture. Although the new iceberg was solid and safe, they decided to move again the year after to an even better iceberg. They learned that to survive, constant change must become part of their culture. We can all learn something from the fable of these penguins. Is your organization safe? Are you sure that your iceberg is not melting? Here is a review of the change management process that the penguins used. Step 1, create a sense of urgency. Step 2, pull together the guiding team. Step 3, develop the change vision and strategy. Step 4, communicate for understanding and buy-in. Step 5, empower others to act. Step 6, produce short-term wins. Step 7, don't let up. And step 8, create a new culture. Think about these steps and how they worked for our clever penguins. They can help you embrace change and keep you ahead of your melting iceberg.
I like that one. So were you able to recognize some folks from your own congregation amongst the penguins? Jerry, which ones? Which penguins? I don't want to know the people in the congregation. Oh, Jerry went away. He was nodding and then he went away.
Sorry,
there you are.
I pushed the wrong button. No, I think we all have those folks as, larger churches, ours being one that, you find those folks who are skeptical about change, those who are enthusiastic, those who are, based on the facts, and so, we all have them all in our churches. So I certainly recognized folks in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will say this if I can. I don't know
Yeah.
if it's the time to say it, but I 2 years ago came off Woodlawn's transition team. Woodlawn went through intentional interim ministry with Reverend Dale, and Ross Bartlett also assisted our congregation with congregational meetings and various other supports. I will say this: I wish the transition team had this little video, the not the penguin, although the penguin, yes, but
Yes.
just the entire session we've done to this point, and probably the next session. I think it would be helpful for a transitional team being pulled together in a congregation to have this as a grounding before they even begin the work. I will say this, obviously we were well led by Reverend Dale and by Reverend Ross, because as I look at everything that was laid out, we essentially went through the entire process. And so I'm grateful to have been a part of a group of people who were well led and who followed the process. And despite and Neil, you raised the issue of timing and how long it takes and decision making, and I certainly went through all of that as well. But I will say this, staying true to the process and taking the time it needs to do what needs to be done. I will simply say to you and your church, you should look forward to the investment you've made, because we have two incredible ministers now at Woodlawn that process helped to create their job descriptions, and for us to have consultation with not only the congregation but every team in the church. We met with every team, talked about their expectations, what we did right at Woodlawn, what we could do differently. A very long, very arduous, very um, challenging process. But I will say without hesitation, I've been on many committees of the church in my 40 years with the United Church of Canada, and that transition team, in my opinion, was the most consequential work I've ever done.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. My suspicion is that Reverend Dale and that Ross knew all this stuff and built it into the process, even if they hadn't taught it all to you explicitly before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
One of the challenges.
completely with what you're saying. Sorry to interrupt, Ross. I completely agree with what you're saying, and the process of going through the thought, and intentional work to transition is absolutely essential. Frustrates me is when we get to a point when we're ready to. After that, there's necessary. Oh well, we can't wait until we can't do anything till they weeks from now to say yes, you did it the way it was
Right.
supposed to be done. When we
Right.
know it was because it's been approved already. I just anyway that's all. But I completely agree that about taking the time.
Yeah. Bureaucracy continues to be a thing. Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Ross, you were going to say?
Oh, it's just after a couple of decades of doing this kind of work, it just is. I'm still boggled by the fact that there are congregations that are resistant to any notion that there is a process and that we've actually learned. I mean, as a church writ large, we have the scars to prove that we've learned this stuff. And it may be my stage in life, but I just find it like I can tell. I mean, I know congregations right now that are going to be in trouble because they are refusing to do the basic stuff. It's like, I'm not going to train, I'm just going to start running that marathon. Like, come on, it just like life isn't like that then. And as both Jerry and Neil and others on here know, it's not rocket science, but there are learnings and there are things we have to do, and they are not necessarily natural. I mean, there are those in that bell curve. I like to refer to the people who've never met a change they didn't like. And then there are the other people who never met a change they didn't hate.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
just have to accept that they are there. And I think the one of the challenges is that well-meaning people in the church don't always accept the fact that the people who have never met a change they didn't hate are prepared to see the church die rather than make change. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how clear we need to be. And something that I've been sort of learning more and more the importance of over the last few years is what's the cost of not changing?
Yeah. Not changing.
In
Absolutely.
our
Yeah.
churches, we are really good about counting the cost of change, both in dollars and who it's going to piss off and all the rest of it. What's the cost of not changing? And we don't very often do that. The
Yeah.
other thing that I just want to throw in here is that when we're starting something, what are some of the markers of success?
Mhm.
Because we're not dealing with financial profit and loss. It's really hard to know when we've accomplished what we want to accomplish unless we've set out some markers. And if we haven't set out the markers, then the only thing we can do is keep trying harder. We keep
Right.
pouring more energy into this thing because we never know when we've, quote, won. And like those are just some things that I see how repeated over and over again in congregations.
Yeah. The first part of what you said there takes me back to Cotter's first step about creating that sense of urgency, where you talk about there are people who'd rather see the church die than, and I think there are often people aren't used to having that kind of honest conversation because I think as Canadians in particular and Canadian church people, we're too busy being nice to everyone. And that's not always a good thing. I mean, nice can avoid issues forever. Where what that creating of urgency is to name truths that are really, really uncomfortable. We don't often have like a glass bottle that we can fill with water and see if it freezes and breaks. It's very rarely that clear cut. I mean, Michelle, you talked about, givings going down. At what point does that actually become an urgent crisis? Um, and that absolutely needs to be addressed as opposed to simply you moving around deck chairs kind of thing and hoping that that will solve the problem. Yeah, for sure. One of the other pieces that was in the film, and it was subtle, but and it's not actually in um, Cotter's shorter pieces of this change management process. I think it was Alice the Penguin who brought out that sepia photo of their founders, who actually had built this into their DNA as a community when they brought us to this iceberg. Um, Most of us go to churches that actually have changed quite a bit through the years. And it can be really, really helpful to take a step back and to go, oh, you're right. We actually do know how to do this, or we actually have changed in response to changing circumstances in the past. And what did we learn from that? And if we can include the elder members of the congregations in those and celebrate what they have done in those conversations, that can be incredibly powerful to just be able to draw on the living memory of the congregation, and that we can get through changes and actually survive and even thrive. So that piece, it's not sort of explicitly in Cotter's model, but I think it does go back a little bit to that sense of identity, like what is core to who we are as a group, as a church, as a congregation. Is it this particular building? Is it this particular form of worship? Is it this particular structure? Is it this particular minister or set of people? Or is it something else? And defining what that is a really, really hopeful and helpful exercise that can help people to understand that even if we lose this, that, or the other, we will still be us. And that's really important. And I think in amalgamation work, that's particularly important because you end up with two groups who are doing that. And when we come together, are we going to lose who we were or are we going to strengthen who? So, Beth, you talked about an amalgamation. Was that the experience of that amalgamation?
That was a really messy one, but I had a really good one
Okay.
when I I actually ministered where I had five churches in a pastoral charge, and two of them closed and amalgamated with the largest, and that was amalgamation that went really well, with a lot of communication, a lot of empowerment, a really great transition team. And so it kind of made up for the first one I ever experienced, which where I was just a layperson. So I don't know, maybe I learned something over the years. But yeah, and I'm part of United Fresh Start, and we do transition things. But as I was saying, we have a meeting the other day. Sometimes it's kind of like, well, you need to eat your vegetables. We know it's good for us, but it's hard to convince people this is the process because it's long. One of my books I like to refer to is the Canoeing the Mountains.
Yeah.
And it goes back to the story of the 40, I always say, the time in the desert and all that, and, all the sabotage and all that, those pieces. But I always try and tell people when we're trying to trust the slow work of God, never mind the region, the slow work of God, that, it took 40 years for them to get where they needed to get. And if they had come out after 10 years or 20 years, they wouldn't be the people they were after 40 years, which was, what was, planned for them. So to remember, we have to trust.
Yeah. I'm just gonna, as we got a couple of minutes left. I think I've got time to do this. Is to just go through Cotter's change management piece, a little bit more in depth. So this first piece about creating urgency, helping the community to understand the need for change is another way to put that, and that it needs to happen kind of now. Is a lot of truth telling. What are the threats that are, if you could go back to Levine's force field, right? What are the changes? What are the forces in favor of the change? What are the threats that are driving the need for the change? Why do we need to change? What are the possible scenarios for the future? You don't have to decide yet, but what are some options so that people can start to think about options? And this kind of the last one here about requesting support and information from those outside leadership and outside the organization, people like Ross, people like diocesan staff, people like there are people out there who do this stuff and who know what the possibilities could be, and know how to have conversations about them. Whoops. Forming that coalition, finding the effective change leaders, and these may not be people who are in traditional leadership roles. Jerry, you talked about a transition committee, and sometimes those people might have to give up other parts of their work in order to focus on the change, and there might need to be other people that take on that sort of the ongoing work of the congregation, so that the change leaders can focus on doing that. You need those different viewpoints and constituencies. The Penguins did that. Recalling those group dynamics of forming this committee so that they can or team to understand what gifts they all bring, and then asking for commitment from every team member to the change that we're talking about, so that you're not fighting amongst yourselves that the change needs to happen. And that's where the weather forecaster might be asked to step aside. What are the organization's values that are central to this change? And this might be where you go back to another story from your church's, your congregation's history that illustrates those values. Developing one or two sentences of what you're talking about to communicate it. Make ice signs. Okay, you don't have to make ice signs, but that penguin with, it was like 3 words just so that people can catch it. And ensure that every member of the Change Coalition can explain the strategy in less than 5 minutes. I would say in that 1 or 2 sentences, honestly, because otherwise people aren't going to understand. It's too complex. You need to break it down. And communicate the vision often, clearly, and every chance you get. Talked about that a little bit already. Using that vision to guide daily encounters and solving everyday problems. Well, if we really value X, or we're moving towards Y, what does that have to say to this situation we're talking about? addressing people's concerns, take risks, removing obstacles, identifying the change leaders, and ensuring they have the authority for the change work. There's nothing more disempowering for people than thinking that they have the buy-in from the whole community to do the thing, and then have the community say, no, actually, we're not going to, after people have put in tons and tons of work. So make sure that that's in place. Also, you want to make sure that the people who are doing this work don't have so many other tasks that they don't have time. And that is a pretty common thing in church land. Rewarding the people for the work they do that supports the new direction. You don't have to give them medals that say hero on them, but that'd be nice. Checking systems and structures. We talked about that a little bit already. And act quickly to remove the barriers. No, you don't need to be giving us the weather forecasts anymore. Creating short-term win. I smiled when I said that. I want to be really clear. We don't need No-No's weather forecasts. We still need No-No. He's still part of the community. Those short-term wins that move us towards the goal and should be implementable without interference from critics. So these short-term wins are often kind of on the periphery of the bigger thing. So the kids getting involved in making posters and Hero Celebration Day was a short-term win. It involved the younger members of the community, which was great. It's pretty guarded. Like the critics aren't going to give the kids a hard time about making posters to celebrate their heroes. And it's not going to cost a ton of money. It's not going to take a lot of resources. It moves us towards the goal, involves lots of people, and then you can publicly celebrate, So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Then building on the change. In the video, they talked about it as keep at it, just to keep building after every win. What went right? What would increase improvement? Build momentum. That's what this is really about. And fighting complacency. Well, we've already done so much work. Can't we just stop now? And then, as the video said, anchoring the idea of change. So these penguins were going to get ready to move to an even better iceberg every year. Please don't tell your churches that you're going to move to an even better iceberg every year, because that's not really going to be helpful. But talking about the stories of success, often publicly recognizing what's going on, replacing key leaders, and talking again about how this new way of being is connected with who we are as a congregation, as the people of God, can be really, really important, and can again solidify the change in the culture. So I am happy to share these slides. If they would be helpful, I can send them to Ross and he can send them out to all of you. Are there any last thoughts? I know we've got another 10 minutes technically on the clock, but I don't feel I need to stretch this if folks are feeling like we've covered what we needed to do tonight. Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, go for it, Neil.
No, I'd say I'm good. Thank you very much. It's been an excellent session.
Good. I'm glad. I mean, I think some of it is things that you've all experienced and kind of know, but sometimes sitting and spending the time intentionally thinking through what we're doing can be helpful. So, all right, Ross.
All right, then. Thank you very much. And as I mentioned in the email to you, we're winding down the website as the program winds down, and so I will be sending you the link to the video for this directly, and I think I already sent you the readings for the next session, which will be 2 weeks this evening. And so thank you so much, Heather. Thank you for your wisdom and your enthusiasm and your humor. And thank you, folks, for being with us this evening, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.